welcome to Cafe CLIL 17, Making Language Visible, Phil.
Yeah. Hi, Keith. Great stuff. Yep. Let's make it visible.
We've got, it's great. We managed to get a wonderful guest visitor to Cafe CLIL, Dr. Ruslana Vesterlund, to share her knowledge on making language visible, systemic functional linguistics, tell us all about the background to the WIDA standards that she was involved in writing. So let's, without further ado, let's hand over to her and then we'll come back.
Yeah, right. Brilliant.
I'm delighted to be able to welcome Dr. Ruslana Vesterlund to Cafe CLIL today, Cafe CLIL 17. We're called Making Language Visible. And we wanted to ask Ruslana to talk about a number of important initiatives in her work because I think they're very relevant to CLIL. And Phil and I have mentioned the WIDA initiative many times in previous podcasts, and Ruslana has been central in bringing the systemic functional linguistics approach to the latest version of the standards 2020. And more recently, hot off the press at the end of March 2026 is a book Ruslana co-authored along with Sally Humphrey and Olga Malin, Building a Language Toolkit for Teachers, a Functional Approach. And we'll talk about why all of this is important for teaching and learning generally, and particularly, at least from my perspective, why it's relevant for CLIL. And I offered people to make a pot of tea for this, Ruslana, because we usually go with a coffee or something at the beginning, but there's so much to talk about here. Perhaps we could start with you giving a bit of background to the WIDA initiative and latest standards.
Yeah. Thank you so much for having me on. I really delighted to come here and talk to you today about what I talk about as pedagogically useful theory of language. WIDA is a consortium that was formed more than 20 years ago. It's a consortium of U.S. states and territories. So in that consortium, WIDA's primary purpose and the origin came from responding to a federal grant to create a language proficiency assessment, very early 2000s. And a group of people at WIDA, whom I know personally, Tim, Margot, and Mariana, and others, they are the founders and they are the brains behind the original idea.
Yes.
And from the assessment, standards were developed and standards were continued to be refined. Margot Gottlieb was the lead and continues to be the lead on a lot of that work. I was lucky enough to be working at WIDA. I started in 2012 when the 2012 edition was written, and I was implementing it in Minnesota at the Department of Education. And then I was invited for a job as an associate researcher at WIDA in 2012. So in that work, what led us to bring systemic functional linguistics to the latest edition was a lot of research by Luciana de Oliveira, Meg Gebhardt, Maria Brisk, and I was a novice SFL researcher at that time because I am a self-taught SFL scholar, and I stumbled upon it when I was at WIDA reading Halliday. Dr. Mariana Castro gave me a task of developing the can-do descriptors for early years. And when I started reading the literature on early years, I started reading the work of Claire Painter and Michael Halliday. And when that took me into this world of like, wow, language is a meaning-making system, not an inventory of structures, it caused a whole lot of cognitive dissonance. It kept me up at night because it caused a lot of unlearning. Because I was very structural and traditional, like most of us are who come from linguistics. So at WIDA, with the help of other SFL scholars like Meg Gebhardt, Luciana de Oliveira, and we worked a lot with ideas from Beverly Derrionka and Pauline Jones, from their book, Teaching Language in Context, and Dr. Maria Brisk at Boston College, Meg Gebhardt at University of Massachusetts, Amherst. So together with this team, we worked hard to translate SFL into something that could be practical and actionable and learnable. Because SFL is a, which I call is an extravagant theory of language. There is a lot you can do with it. It's been applied in fields outside of education. But often when you first like Google it, it just looks so technical and so inaccessible and so intimidating. So my life's work became to translate SFL for teachers.
Yeah, sure. I mean, if I can jump in there, that brings us, I think, very smoothly to the book, the toolkit for teachers using a functional approach, because I'm glad you put that there, because I as soon as I heard about it, I wanted to grab it and read it before we met, and I managed to do that. And I think, I highly recommend it to any teacher who has an inkling that they need to know something more about the language of their subject. So I do recommend it. It's not just a description of the language of subjects, it's also lots of practical ideas for teachers to activate that language in their classrooms. And I think perhaps there's something we could say about that related to this wonderful resource that you've created. What about pre-service teacher education? What's your experience of how far systems have gone in implementing and incorporating a language awareness within content subject teacher pre-service education? There's a lot to take in there, but I'm sure you know exactly what I mean. What's your experience of the extent to how that's provided for at the moment in your experience?
I think what WIDA 2020 has given us is permission to use systemic functional linguistics as a theory that's relevant to the U.S. context. Because previously it's been a theory that was implemented and integrated into Australian standards, learning standards for regular education teachers. It's not just a theory of language for English second language learners. It's a theory of language, period. It's just how language works. So the WIDA standards gave us sort of like red carpet, as I say, to talk about it in pre-service programs and to teach language in that way in pre-service teacher education programs. And when Sally Humphrey reached out to me to write this book, the idea was exactly that. We want to build a language toolkit to be used in universities' pre- and in-service teacher education programs, so that WIDA standards and the way we talk about language is built from the foundation of teacher preparation, and not after the fact or some ED one day off, that's not integrated. So there is still many scholars at universities that I've mentioned previously have been using SFL in pre and in-service teacher programs and graduate school, and a lot of research was done in primarily TESOL programs. Andres Ramirez, dear friend in Florida State University or University of Florida, sorry, those names sound so similar and I always confuse them. Luciana also was in Miami, and now she's in Virginia. And Maria Brisk is retired but continues to work with teachers in various capacities and across the globe. Meg Gebhardt retired but left a huge legacy with her research, and now Catherine Accurso, who was her student in Canada. So we have a North American presence of SFL, and I do not want to forget to mention the most important person who brought systemic functional linguistics to the United States was Mary Schleppergrell in 2004 with her seminal work of 2004, The Language of Schooling.
Okay.
And then, so from that, we've had more than 2 decades of this work, but we need to, it's still new. It's still extremely new.
Sure.
Because I think one of the main reasons is because it's so different.
Yeah.
We're just not interested in defining language as an inventory of structures or rules to follow. So there is a lot of implications that we have been working on to really integrate language structures into the texts and the meanings that they realize. And so versus, let's work on subject-verb agreement on Thursday and auxiliary verbs on Tuesday. Well, so we do, so I'm jumping ahead of myself, but that's kind of that I hope that our text will help pre and in-service teachers to think about language in the context of text and language in the service of learning and language as a system of choices and not an inventory of structures.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned a system of meaning making. And I mean, my background is languages, and I come from a language teaching background, but I run a school here in Plovdiv, Bulgaria, where I call it a CLIL school because we don't use traditional ELT coursebook material at all. We teach through music and art and science for our youngest children. And when we began to create a curriculum for language within that context, I asked one of my colleagues to do some research on what the Bulgarian preschool and primary school curriculum says about cognitive growth. There's nothing about language in there, but we could overlap our language progression onto what children are, how their thinking is developing from the age of 2 onwards, And that's what our curriculum looks like now, Ruslana. We've got all of these thinking skills, and we link language to those thinking skills through the ages as the children grow with us. And I think that's very rare in foreign language teaching and learning in Europe. I'm not kind of promoting me as somebody doing anything unique, but I think traditionally it's a lexical grammatical progression that most learners meet. They don't meet. Okay, this week we're going to look at what happens to seeds when you put them in the right conditions. And I mentioned seeds because children in my school actually took a tomato, scooped out the seeds, and then presented me with a pot full of these leggy seedlings, which are now in my polytunnel, separated, and the children are going to come on a visit, and I'm hoping to be able to let them pick the fruits months later after they started this project. And Phil and I go on in our podcasts about the value of creating a thinking curriculum rather than a language curriculum, and then embed language on that thinking. I wonder if that rings true to how you feel about your work.
Yeah, I'm just writing some notes as you're talking. I've recently started to think, actually not recently, one of the earliest blogs. So my blog was a way to process my learning, and I started writing, I believe, in 2014 or 2015.
Okay.
And sometime in those years, I remember creating a progression of language that has a horizontal climb and a vertical axis, horizontal and vertical axes. And what the horizontal is known to us. And I'm going to get to your question from here, or you comment on that. The horizontal is known to us. It's from simple to complex sentences, right from sentence fragments to elaboration, from imprecise vocabulary to precise vocabulary, you name it, from dropping off ed to form past tense to finally forming regular and irregular past tense, all of those grammatical structures. So that is the horizontal. we rarely talk about vertical language progression. And that's the thing you were talking about when you were saying that we need to pay attention how language is developed through the years of schooling. If you read Derevyanka's book and Jones, Bev, and Pauline's book, Teaching, they gave me these words back, 12 years ago, to think about language vertically, language through the years of schooling.
Yeah.
And how it has to follow the trajectory of learning. Yeah. And the progression of language demand through the years of schooling. So you could lay out that progression, one way to lay out that progression through genres.
Yeah, yeah.
More simple genres in, for example, first grade, like when your students are observing those tomatoes, they could write a procedural recount of what they did to plant a garden. They could also write explanation of what causes plants to grow versus what causes seeds to die.
Yeah.
And it's so simple in those years, but those are the things that we attach to their learning goals and developmental stages. And then we go up in grades and we get from sequential explanations to causal explanations, from a life cycle explanation of what's a life cycle of a plant,
exactly.
up to causal explanation, up to a systems explanation, to study our school backyards as ecosystems. I remember working with the third grade group when I was writing, before we were writing the standards at WIDA.
Yeah.
I had a tremendous opportunity to research in schools and to do research in schools and to really study how literacy is conceptualized in schools. And of course, I knew it, that literacy was very fragmented, right? So in the US, there is a literacy block in the morning. Kids write about something, and then there is the content learning in the afternoon if you have time for it, because science and social studies have been absolutely reduced to nothing. So if you're lucky and you have some science learning and social studies, then but it's still very separate from the literacy. I'm like, what are we talking and reading and writing about if we are separating it from the knowledge that we just built in the afternoon?
Absolutely.
So that was definitely because SFL is like, hey, what are your learning goals? What do you want kids to be able to do at the end of this unit?
Yeah.
So you always start with, the backwards planning from Wiggins and McTighe is super helpful just to think with the end in mind. But what we add in there is the summative genre. From the beginning, we identify what is your summative task, and then how is that task realized as genre? What genre is it?
Yeah.
And if you go to my book, it's actually become a helpful resource to me.
Sure.
I think it's chapter 3 where we define the school genres. So is it a causal explanation? Is it an argument? And what kind of argument?
Yeah.
Is it, I don't have anything bookmarked yet. I'm just flipping through the pages. Is it
narrative or informative?
A narrative, a personal recount? What kind of narrative?
Sure.
Is it a personal recount, or is it a fictional narrative? Is it an argument? Is it a science argument, or is it an ELA argument? And those are two very different things. Nobody's interested in your opinions in science. Data has to be the evidence. So we get into, it's on page 65, where we are identifying key K8 genres. We're not getting into macro genres. Those are kind of grade 8 and 12 or 9, 12. But a lot of these are a common genre. So then what we do, if we go back to your CLIL school, which is very progressive, because I agree, typically it's a syllabus of linguistic grammatical structures that's taught, like, oh, adjectives, right? So if we go back to that, then the progression could be built. What are the curricular demands and what are the genres that realize those demands?
Yeah.
Then you create a repository of mentor texts, would be multimodal texts and their analyses. So WIDA Standards could come in, or Systemic Functional Linguistics, could come in as a way to analyze the text to make language visible for the teacher first. Then from the analysis of the mentor text, you can create language goals for your units. So you have basically a vertical scope and sequence of genres of schooling. Another group who's done work in Europe on this is Lexis Education. I think John Polius started it, and they're worth checking out because they've done really, I think they have created these scopes and sequences to make these knowledge structures, which I call visible, of schooling, and then the language that realizes them.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's possibly a very good point for us to stop, Ruslana, because I think we've already agreed that, I mean, with your, I know you're very busy, but if you agree, we'll come back again with something specific. So you've actually brought us to where that might be the next springboard to something for us to get our heads around. Resources, tasks, test items, or whatever within the different genre. And I think, you know, I'd like to thank you for your time today to give us such a rich background to Systemic Functional Linguistics, making language visible, and the WIDA standards. And so thank you.
Yeah, it was my pleasure.
In terms of the WIDA standards, the thing I took away from Ruslana's contribution, there were many things actually, but one thing that stuck in my mind is how she described this vertical progression, and how language in the WIDA standards is audited and prepared following that vertical progression through schooling. And I thought that was very interesting, because you and I frequently talk about that, don't we, when we talk about kind of traditional ELT and a CLIL approach, which is latching onto the development of thinking skills for learners as they go through school. What's your take on that?
Well, I really like that. I liked 1,000 things. We'll have to get it back on. But I particularly like, well, she talked about a horizontal progression, didn't she, and a vertical axis. I think she was trying to looking at it graphically, and I like the fact that she talked about the horizontal progression being, you know, what one would call that traditional lexical grammatical progression, but the vertical was the thinking skills, was the cognitive side of it, and of course that's just a very simple but brilliant idea, because if you look at the CEFR, for example, which is a very powerful tool, of course, in language teaching. The one slight problem with the CFR is that, of course, it does map. Well, actually, you always think of the CFR in vertical terms, don't you? Because, you know, A1, A2, B1, B2. But if you look at it in horizontal terms, it is that progression. But of course, on the vertical, you can't map cognitive skills onto that, because and of course the CFR cannot cope with that. Because the problem is with the CFR, not the problem, but the limitation of it is, of course, that you can have an adult learner with A1 who's perfectly cognitively mature, and you can have an 11-year-old who's a C1. You know, that coping with that and mapping that is impossible. So I rather like this idea that you can map the cognitive progression of a human being, as it were, and also you can also map that linguistic progression that goes along with it, which is actually a bit more Chomskyan than Ruslana was admitting, but we can see it in terms if we see it in terms of systemic functional linguistics, it becomes a lot easier.
Yeah, well, they looking at the standards, they actually age group learners. So we're not talking about language for grade 6. It might be a bracket, say grade 6 to 9 or something like that, and that age bracket will have an amount of language that belongs to the curriculum as it goes through those grades,
Yeah.
which I think is sensible. But it is an interesting idea, isn't it, that you can map language for children as they go through schooling. We had a project like that in Anglia School where I gave a bonus to one of my colleagues to research the Bulgarian young learners curriculum. So they have nature studies, they have music and stuff for the thinking skills, so that we could try and overlap a little bit in our language progression in Anglia School, while the children in their regular classes in school were doing their things. And we did a lot of work on that. The whole of the curriculum now is based on a progression of thinking skills. We don't package language from simple to complex, for example. You know, our children, young children, are hypothesizing, you know.
Well, there's so many things that you said that I like, and it's all down that route as well. I'd love to pick. I think we have to pick up on the phrase that she used quite naturally. She just said, "Language in the service or at the service of learning." No?
Perfect.
I mean, absolutely. That's what I think we've been talking about for the last 16 podcasts, but we never used that phrase. But that, you know, and what we don't want, in a sense, is learning at the service of language. Now, but we can get onto that later. But let's stay on that positive point now. And I love the way that she picked up on the tomatoes. You know, we could,
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
and it's a very simple but very very telling example, isn't it? That I don't know how old the kids are that were doing the tomatoes, Keith. But I don't know, maybe were they pre-literate?
5. They're about 5,
Yeah,
around
okay.
5.
Yeah, so they're pre-literate in both Bulgarian and English.
Yeah.
So you know, what else can you do in a sense? But it's not. But when she said that, well, you know, you could look at the tomatoes and the growth of tomatoes and the process you went through when you were planting the seeds, and you could just they could just narrate that. You know, as Christine Dalton Puffer would say, that's reporting. And of course, a child can report. You know, a child can report at the age of 2.5, at 2, when they're speaking. When they're beginning to speak their own language, you know, functionally, let's say, you know, and that's a perfect example of how you would map it, you know. You know, and of course, later on in the process of the tomatoes, I'm guessing, Keith, that they do a bit more than that, but obviously only so far as a 5-year-old is able to.
Well, what we decided to do with that, I mean, I feel a little bit nervous about them now, because I'm responsible for these tomato plants that my children have given to me, you know, as leggy seedlings that and now they're all individually potted, and I'm sending them updates. This is something we've sort of done. They get these little clips from my polytunnel to play and look at and engage with in the classroom. But we'll organise a trip. They'll come when we've got fruit, and they'll harvest, and we'll get them to look back at the process and do, as you said, report on what they've done. We'll have a look at conditions, you know, because right now the temperature variation is a bit dangerous for these plants, and they're under these fleece coverings with a plastic sheet on top inside the polytunnel. You know, all of these conditions will be part of the children re-engaging with the plants when they come and have a look at them.
I can imagine what it consists of. You know, it's going to consist of explanation, and you can ask questions. Why? You can say, well, you know, why did that one grow more than that one, or why did that one not set off so much? You know, it could be light, or it could be whatever. No? Of course, you're going to have explanation in there as well, not simply description. But I just like the way that she started with that idea that simply you could get them to narrate the process that they've been through. Yeah, bang. That turns on a light for me as a teacher trainer, and it would turn on a light, I think, for a language teacher. Surely
one thing to mention about that reporting and narrating is what the medium is, because of, in our case, the children work with each other. Usually there are products they take home, so they're reporting to their parents about what they've done. But one gift we got from the colleagues in Cyprus, a wonderful thing, is, I think I've mentioned it before, the talking wall, where each pocket in this poster size instrument has a chip in it, and the children can use images, press the button, record themselves, and so they can create a narrative using the talking wall and images. So we may do that. We may get them to use images of the beginning, you know, scooping out the seeds from the tomato in the very beginning that they bought from the supermarket, and eventually to picking fruit from the plants later. So I think that's important, isn't it? What the instrument is for reporting, for narrating, and there are many ways of doing it. The other thing I wanted to mention about Ruslana's contribution was the amount or lack of awareness of this. So let's call it systemic functional linguistics, but essentially how language progresses as children go through schooling in textbook materials and in pre-service teacher education. You know, we did touch on both of these things. But you know, what was your take on that?
Absolutely, I totally agree with her. And early on, she did mention that the very phrase "systemic functional linguistics" is a bit scary. You know, she used the word, she used the adjective "scary," I think, which it is. But actually, it's really quite simple. And I think that it should really be a part of all. Well, perhaps it should be a part of all teachers' training. You know, but certainly it should be a part of language teachers' training and certainly subject teachers' training. And I always like the metaphor or the example, you know, where you talk about Hallidayan function in a sense, but systemic is a kind of scary word. But it's not actually it's not actually about system. What Halliday meant was that there's an infinite amount of possibilities. For example, let's say you're married or you're living in sin and you're sleeping with your partner. When you wake up in the morning, okay, it's systemic because when you wake up in the morning, there's, according to Chomsky anyway, there's an infinite amount of sentences that you can produce in generative grammar. But according to Halliday, it's different, because when you wake up in the morning, you're going to say certain things. You're going to say, "Good morning, dear. Did you sleep well?" Or, "Oh God, you know, it's raining outside." Or, you get up and make the poached eggs." It's very unlikely. It's very unlikely, and your marriage wouldn't last very long if you woke up in the morning and you said, "Hey, you know, that thing that Einstein was talking about, you know, gravity and the speed of light, you know, that's I just think that's really amazing, you know. Get up and make the poached eggs, you know." So what that's the systemic aspect, but the functional aspect is that there's a function to saying, "Hi, hello, dear, how did you sleep?" You know, and so we only say certain things when we wake up in the morning. The first thing we say. Later in the day, of course, the functions of language change because we do lots of different things.
Just to chip in,
but it's one.
That's the clear link with the cognitive discourse functions, isn't it?
Well, that's what I mean. When you say systemic, all those possibilities, then you say function. You limit the possibilities, and then you limit the possibilities to. She said the language of schooling. You know, what Schreppe-Gell's book in 2004 about the language of schooling. Of course, the functions there are all connected to school disciplines. We've talked about this before, but it makes a lot of sense, you know. And so you can. It's very easy to demystify systemic.
I think so. I mean, in the book, let's mention her book again, and we'll put the reference to it in the notes as well. There are a couple of chapters that are excellent on exactly this issue for demystifying language. One is lexical density. So that looks at noun groups and how they get more complex. So from children with BICS, early years of learning, basic interpersonal communication skills, they communicate largely in verbs. But as they go through school, they become, they nominalize, they make more noun structures in the subject, in the curricula. And that chapter breaks all that down and shows how it goes from more simple to more complex, depending on the genre. The other chapter that's worth mentioning is grammatical complexity. So like the complexity of noun groups, they deal in the book with how the grammar becomes more complex as you go through schooling to the CALP, cognitive academic language proficiency.
Yeah, nominalization is a classic, isn't it? It's that classic moment where you notice that a student is beginning to develop linguistically, and you know can kind of think a bit more deeply, and can cope with as we talked about, you know, stretching and deepening. They're starting to cope with more complex stuff, and they need.
I've got students who exactly on this issue, who very fluent speakers of English who struggle with phrasal verbs, you know, because because you stick a preposition on go and all of a sudden, my goodness, what does that mean? Whereas the Latin version of it is largely accessible to many European people who come from a background where that verb will be in their language, you know, whereas the phrasal verbs, and they deal with phrasal verbs as well in the classroom.
Well, academic language, I will say, CALP tends to avoid phrasal verbs. I mean, there are academic phrasal verbs, but it tends to avoid, you know, the going along with kind of phrasal verb because
Exactly.
the Latin is, as you say, more accessible, and it's certainly for Spanish speakers, it's way more accessible, and so the Spanish speakers will tend to overgeneralize. But it's a good example. But she's talking about making that visible, you know. So if we make that visible to students, it's just such a fantastic resource, you know.
Yeah, I think so too. I mean, the reference that comes to mind, I mean, I try and create images and diagrams in workshops with colleagues when we deal with their subject language. You know, and there is a wonderful document that comes again out of North America called the Language Functions Toolkit, similar to the title of Ruslan and colleagues' book, but that weds together functions of the curriculum with diagrams that make sense to go with that particular. So cause effect is two cells with an arrow, for example, or unique and shared characteristics is a Venn diagram, for example. You know, all of that has been thought about, and if there isn't a diagram, make one up that makes logical sense, because the visibility of the concept and hence the language is crucial to preparing learning.
Well, talking about visibility, Keith, I mean, yes, another thing that she said that I picked up on was, she used a phrase I'd not used before, but she talked about summative genre in terms of text. And if you look at that from a language teacher's point of view, who's trying to do a bit of CLIL, for example, then I often try and encourage teachers to do a bit of PBL, project-based learning, because it stretches.
Yeah.
You know? It has to stretch. And so that's the easiest way to stretch. But if you do stretch, then I think what Ruslana was implying was that at the end, there's going to be some sort of textual production, okay? It might be oral, it might be written, it might be both. But what does that textual production consist of? Well, it's going to consist of a genre. No? The kids are either going to describe, they're going to explain, they're going to persuade, they're going to argue, whatever, they're going to debate. There's going to be a text genre. And so that's super important, but she talked about backward planning as well. And so the backward planning concept means that if you're going to have X genre at the end of that PBL stretch, then at some point, at quite a lot of points in that route to the end of the PBL, you're going to have to deal with that genre. And so you're making that genre super visible to kids, and that's exactly the patterns that we worked on here in the Basque Country in the curriculum. You know, working on that summative genre, as she called it, at the end, and then working that into the content. You don't want to make the whole PBL project about that genre. That would be a bit tedious, you know. But it's got to be visible in the steps. You can't just do the steps and then say, right, now you've got to argue. There's no way you can do that. You've got to work on that genre before, and she was talking about that. It's interesting.
Yeah. I think that's a good moment for us to stop. I think we've got a huge amount of things to say, but we've got to a point again, like the discussion with Ruslana, where we're now beginning to touch on specific aspects of the curriculum, and that's where she said she'd like to come back, Phil. So perhaps in exchange with her by email or whatever, we'll hone in on a piece of content, curriculum content, which we can then unpack with her input, which I think would be extremely interesting for listeners and viewers to Cafe CLIL.
It would be great. And also, Keith, I was really impressed by the fact that you actually wore a shirt for the first time. I think that was fantastic. And so look, you didn't notice, but I've worn one today as well, just in case. Yeah. So I think to get you to wear a shirt again, I think would also.
I'm afraid you've got me in my gardening gear, Phil.
Tomato gear, okay.